Imagine walking up to your front door after a long weekend away, only to find an eviction notice slapped across your front door. Your own property. That's exactly what happened to me, and let me tell you, I was furious. I had no idea what was going on, but as soon as I read those words, I felt my stomach drop. The letter was from the HOA, claiming that I'd violated several rules and that I needed to vacate the premises immediately. What rules? I hadn't received any warnings, no notices, no nothing. It didn't make sense. I'd been living in this neighborhood for years, paying my dues, following all the ridiculous HOA regulations Susan, the HOA president, loved to enforce. But this was too far. This wasn't just a fine or a complaint. This was an eviction notice. My home, my sanctuary, was at risk because Susan decided she didn't like the way I cut my grass last month. It didn't add up. I couldn't just sit back and let her push me around, especially when I knew something was wrong. So, I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't just going to fight her on this, I was going to expose her for the fraud she really was. But the worst part? I wasn't alone. Susan had the entire HOA board backing her up. They were all in on this. I was about to walk into the lion's den. What would they do when they realized I wasn't going down quietly? If you've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA or been caught in a fight for your home, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear about how I stood up to the HOA president. This is just the beginning. You won't believe what happens next. With the eviction notice in my hand, I headed straight for the HOA office, determined to confront Susan and get to the bottom of this. But what I didn't expect was who would be waiting for me inside. Would I get the truth, or was I walking right into her trap? The moment I walked into the HOA office, I felt the heat of the situation instantly. Susan was sitting behind her desk, looking as smug as ever, her glasses perched on her nose like she had the world under control. But that wasn't the worst part. Sitting beside her was a lawyer, a sharp-looking man in a suit who immediately sized me up with a dismissive look. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just Susan trying to bully me anymore. This was a full-on power play. She'd gone legal. I held up the eviction notice, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. What is this? You're trying to evict me from my home without warning, and now you've brought a lawyer into it. I asked, trying to keep my composure. But inside, I was boiling. I had a right to be here. I was the one who'd paid for this house, the one who'd put in the time, the effort, the money. And yet here I was, being treated like an outsider. Susan leaned back in her chair, smiling a little too broadly. Well, Jason, she said in that condescending voice, you've violated several HOA rules, and I'm afraid we've had enough. She glanced at the lawyer, who nodded in agreement. We can discuss this in court if you'd like, but we've already made our decision. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't about rules. This was personal. Susan didn't like me. She never had. She wanted me out, plain and simple, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. But before I could argue further, the lawyer slid a piece of paper across the desk. This is your final warning, he said coldly. If you don't leave by the end of the week, we will take legal action. My heart raced. Was this going to be the fight of my life? Or was I about to lose everything? As I sat there, staring at the paper the lawyer had slid in front of me, I could feel the walls closing in. My mind was racing. How was I going to fight this? I had no idea what was happening, and all the legal jargon Susan and her lawyer were throwing at me only made my head spin. But then, something caught my eye. In the corner of the page, almost hidden, was a small note, one that wasn't in the original documents I had received. The more I looked at it, the more I realized Susan was up to something shady. The paper seemed official, but the dates on the form didn't add up. I'd lived in this house for years, and yet there was a notice about a recent violation that didn't match anything I had been informed of. The signature at the bottom was completely wrong too. It didn't even look like Susan's. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. This wasn't a simple eviction. Susan had forged this paperwork. She was using it as a weapon to force me out of my own home, and no one else seemed to know about it. I had to act fast. I asked for a copy of the paperwork so I could take it home and review it, claiming I wanted to look over it with a lawyer of my own. Susan hesitated but eventually handed it over, her smile faltering just slightly. I could see the fear creeping into her eyes now. She wasn't expecting me to catch on this quickly. I rushed back to my house, my mind racing. As I sat at my desk, scanning the document, I felt a sense of clarity. This was all a setup. Just as I was about to dig deeper into the documents, my phone buzzed. It was a message from one of my neighbors. Susan's been trying to evict other people using the same fake papers. Could I expose her before it was too late? Or was I about to walk into an even bigger trap? The moment I read that message from my neighbor, I knew I had to act fast. Susan had been doing this to other people too. I wasn't the only one she'd been trying to push out of the neighborhood with fake eviction notices. The thought made my blood boil. How many others had she bullied into submission, convincing them to leave without a fight? I couldn't let her get away with it anymore, so I decided to do what Susan clearly never expected. I was going to expose her lies. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering all the evidence I could find. I took screenshots of the forged documents, reached out to the neighbors who'd been affected, and made sure I had everything in order. This wasn't just about saving my home. It was about saving the neighborhood from a woman who thought she could get away with anything. By evening, I had everything I needed. I sent out a group message to every neighbor who had been affected, inviting them to a community meeting at my place. I told them it was time for all of us to stand together. No more fear. No more letting Susan run the show. The next morning, I walked straight to Susan's office. She was sitting there as usual with her smug little grin, ready to deal with me like I was a nuisance. But today was different. Today, I had the power. I pulled out all the evidence, all the forged documents, and slammed them down on her desk. "You're going to explain this to everyone," I said, my voice steady. The room was silent, her face drained of color as she looked down at the papers in front of her, realizing she had nowhere to hide. Susan opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room was filled with tension as the neighbors gathered behind me, waiting for her to respond. Would she try to lie her way out again? Or was this the moment she'd finally face the truth? The tension in the room was suffocating. Susan stood there stunned, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form an excuse but couldn't. The other neighbors stood behind me, their eyes locked on Susan, waiting for her to explain herself. But there was nothing she could say. The proof was undeniable. She had forged the documents, manipulated the HOA rules, and tried to run me and others out of our homes. For a moment, she didn't move. The smug, confident woman who had ruled over the neighborhood like a tyrant for so long was now a deer caught in the headlights. Her power was slipping away, and she knew it. One of the neighbors, a woman who had been on the receiving end of Susan's abuse, stepped forward. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you? Manipulating us, taking advantage of your position. We trusted you, and you used that trust against us." Susan finally found her voice. "You don't understand. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I'm the one who cares about this place," she snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. She was unraveling in front of us, and it was hard to watch. Her empire of lies was collapsing. I took a step forward, my tone calm but firm. "You don't get to play the victim now, Susan. You're the one who's been hurting this community for your own gain." I turned to the neighbors, nodding toward the papers. "We're not going to let her get away with this. We're going to take action, together." Susan's face went white. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice shaking with anger. But just as she started to storm out, the door swung open. The HOA board members were there, and they had seen everything. Was this the moment she'd lose everything? As the door swung open, the HOA board members stepped inside, their faces tense. I could see the unease in their expressions as they took in the scene. Susan cornered, her lies exposed, and the neighborhood gathered, waiting for justice to be served. The board members had been silent for far too long, turning a blind eye to Susan's manipulation. But today, that silence was about to end. One of the board members, a man named Greg, who had always been more reasonable than Susan, stepped forward. "Susan, we've been receiving complaints for months about your behavior. We've had enough." His voice was firm, and the truth was unmistakable. This was the end of Susan's reign. Susan's face turned red, her hands trembling as she desperately tried to salvage the situation. "You can't do this to me," she shouted, but the damage was done. The truth was out. Greg turned to me, offering a small nod of apology. Jason, you've done the right thing by standing up to this. We'll be investigating everything. Susan will be removed from the HOA immediately. As the board members made their way to Susan, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. My home was mine again. I turned to the neighbors who had gathered around, and they all nodded in agreement, some smiling, others looking at Susan with a mix of disbelief and anger. The neighborhood had been taken back from her, and it felt incredible. If you've ever had to fight for your home or stand up to someone abusing their power, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of justice, and share this with anyone who's been through a similar situation. Together we can make sure the truth always prevails. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to confront an HOA or fight for what's right.